Welcome to The Explainer. So imagine you're just walking down a completely normal modern European street, right? You turn a corner and bam, you suddenly hit a militarized wall. Today, we're diving into an island that is literally living a double life. We're talking about Cyprus. It's this fascinating place where a physical line drawn on a map literally dictates two entirely different realities. We're going to unpack the modern history of this divided island, specifically zeroing in on that pivotal era from the 1983 declaration right up to the present day. We're going to look at the deep geopolitical stakes, the drastically contrasting economies, and just what everyday life actually looks like on both sides of a frozen conflict.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. First, the 1983 declaration. Second, the 2004 Annan Plan. Third, what each side actually wants. Fourth, the economic divide. Fifth, life along the Green Line. And finally, number 6, the future of Cyprus.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the 1983 Declaration.
So to understand how we got here, we have to look back just a bit. Following a period of really intense intercommunal conflict and then a 1974 coup orchestrated by the Greek military junta, which was aiming for union with Greece, Turkey launched a military operation. As a result, they assumed control of more than a third of the island. Now, the situation just kind of sat in this incredibly tense holding pattern until November 15th, 1983. On that exact day, the Turkish Cypriot leadership made a unilateral declaration of independence. They established what they called the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, or the TRNC. Almost immediately after, the United Nations Security Council stepped in with some major resolutions, notably 541 and 550, which fundamentally shaped the international legal standing of this brand new entity.
And the immediate result of all this, a massive geopolitical stalemate. I mean, on one side, you have the entire international community, led by the UN Security Council, categorically condemning the TRNC's declaration. They basically called it legally invalid and demanded its withdrawal. In fact, literally no country in the world recognized this new state, except for one. And that one country, of course, was the Republic of Turkey. Turkey provided immediate diplomatic recognition along with absolutely crucial economic and military backing. And, this created this profound diplomatic split screen that is literally still in place to this very day.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 2004 Annan Plan. Now, the Annan Plan, which was named after the UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, was this massive 9,000-page comprehensive settlement proposal. The whole goal was to reunify the island of Cyprus as a bizonal, bicommunal federation, and to do it just in time for its accession to the European Union on May 1st, 2004. Think about how incredibly rare that is, right? They bypassed the politicians entirely to put a 9,000-page constitutional fate directly into the hands of the citizens. It was a totally unprecedented UN-mediated transition that was put to both communities in simultaneous referendums on April 24th, 2004. So what happened? Well, the outcome on the Greek Cypriot side was pretty definitive. An overwhelming majority, we're talking 75.83%, voted no to the Annan Plan. Now, our sources tell us this rejection wasn't just out of nowhere. It was rooted in some really deep concerns. Many Greek Cypriots were terrified of the dissolution of their internationally recognized 1960 republic. Plus, they felt the plan seriously infringed upon their human rights. Specifically, they were worried about restricted rights of return to their former properties in the north, especially since the plan allowed many Anatolian Turks who had moved to Cyprus after 1974 to keep their residence rights. But then, in stark contrast, the Turkish Cypriot community voted quite differently. A really strong majority, nearly 65%, actually voted yes. For them, you see, this plan represented a desperately needed way out of their international isolation and some pretty crippling economic embargoes. They really saw reunification and EU integration as their path forward. But because of these completely diverging votes, the Republic of Cyprus was admitted into the EU just a week later as a divided island, and EU law was completely suspended in the north. Which brings us to Section 3. What each side actually wants today.
Historically, these two communities were driven by deeply competing nationalisms. You had enosis, which basically means union with Greece, favored by the Greek Cypriots, and taksim, meaning partition, favored by the Turkish Cypriots. Today, those historical echoes absolutely shape what they demand for a state structure. Greek Cypriots strongly prefer a unified state or a federation with a single sovereignty. They view the Republic of Cyprus as the one and only legitimate government. Conversely, Turkish Cypriots push for two politically equal, independent founding states. They are really pushing back against being treated as just a minority.
And when you actually look at the public consciousness,
you see how deep this divide goes. Survey data shows that Greek Cypriots overwhelmingly view the post-1974 reality as a destructive occupation that completely decimated their institutions. But for Turkish Cypriots, the post-1974 era is viewed differently. It allowed them to create their own administrative structures. Though, to be fair, they do acutely recognize the severe economic and isolation issues that came right along with it.
Okay, let's transition to Section 4, the economic divide.
Now, at first glance, if you look at a 9.3% GNP growth in the North compared to the South's 3.6% between 2002 and 2004, you might think, wow, the North is really outperforming the South. But context is everything here, folks. Our sources note that this was really just a temporary boom. It was driven heavily by the devaluation of the Turkish lira and a massive surge in construction because everyone expected the Annan Plan to pass. Despite that little catch-up phase, the northern economy remains much, much smaller overall. It's heavily hampered by a total lack of direct international trade.
So, what's the true economic penalty of this political isolation? Well, it's 42.5%. A really comprehensive study from the early 2000s found that asking prices for housing units in the unrecognized North were only 42.5% of the prices for comparable units in the South. And for land, it was even lower, literally just 17.1%. That is a staggering gap.
Day to day, this creates two vastly different realities on the ground. Down in the South, you have this high-income, service-oriented economy that is fully integrated into the Eurozone. They have a standard Western European lifestyle with high-quality infrastructure that gets heavily subsidized by EU funds. Meanwhile, up in the north, the economy is hugely reliant on the fluctuating Turkish lira and subsidies directly from Ankara. Yet surprisingly, it operates a really robust electronic banking infrastructure through Turkey, mostly to bypass those international banking embargoes. The north is actually often described as having a much more relaxed, kind of authentically Mediterranean pace, and they heavily invest in things like universities and casino tourism. Let's move on to Section 5, Life Along the Green Line.
So what is the Green Line? Well, it's a 180-kilometer demilitarized buffer zone. It was established and then expanded over decades, and it's now actively patrolled by UN peacekeepers. The crazy thing is, it cuts right through the capital city of Nicosia, which actually makes it the last divided capital in all of Europe. It's this eerie, quiet strip of frozen land that physically separates the bustling, modern developments of the Eurozone South from the developing, Turkey-backed North.
And honestly, nothing captures the sheer tragedy of this division quite like the ghost town of Varosha. Once upon a time, this was the premier tourist destination in the entire Mediterranean, but its inhabitants fled in 1974, and it was completely fenced off by the military. Our sources describe it perfectly. Let me quote this. The town remains a haunting symbol of the conflict, a landscape of decaying luxury hotels and empty high-rises where property rights have been frozen for half a century. While there have been some recent unilateral moves to partially open a few beaches, it still remains this stark, almost cinematic reminder of an unresolved past.
And finally, Section 6, the future of Cyprus.
As our sources note, Cyprus currently exists in what you might call a comfortable stalemate. Violence is practically non-existent these days. Everyday life just proceeds normally on both sides of the UN buffer zone. And while the non-agreement obviously isn't ideal, it is, well, manageable. But the big question is manageable enough? Will this manageable non-agreement just become the permanent reality of a two-state coexistence? Or will a new generation somehow find a way to erase the line entirely and return to a unified federal hope? It really leaves you wondering. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and we will catch you next time.